Hey, everybody. It is Dr. Lisa. Thank you so much for joining my podcast. I am Dr. Lisa. I am your host, and welcome. Welcome to all of the new listeners as well. I am so excited today. We are finally to blog 4. Blog 4 is called Dark Angels. You can find Dark Angels written by me on um, my blog. The blog is lisaliggins.chambers.com. If you want to keep up with this podcast, it's best for you to first go to the blog and start reading the entries. One of the reasons that you should do that as well is because when I talk about something such as Dark Angels, which is a very popular blog of mine, a lot of questions come up across the board from all social media platforms that I have, and I'm going to address those, but you will have no idea what I'm talking about if you don't read the blog. So I do appreciate you listening. And thank you so much. If you want to reach me, it's so easy. My email address is kidscanseeghost@gmail.com. I take questions there. You can call in on this podcast and ask me questions. And you can reach me by phone. The number is area code 765 205 1959. So you can ask me questions just about anywhere. I will answer them for you. One of the reasons why Blog 4 was so popular and I've gotten so many questions about it is because it is dealing directly with the dark side of the supernatural that kids under my care could see. And a lot of people are talking about demons, which are also called dark angels to the kids. When I do talk about this, I want you to understand that my information comes from children and adolescents, and some of their parents. Sometimes kids don't always describe these things the way that adults do. So when I describe them to you in my blog or wherever you see me on social media writing about it, I want you to remember that I'm talking from the mindset of a child. And a lot of times I can interpret it, but also keep in mind that I I'll say that again. I do not have the gift or the ability to see anything but what's in front of me, like the walls next to me. So this is not a gift that I possess. This is a gift that the children had that I worked with. And why they have them or had them is another area that I'm going to cover today. First, I want to give you a little bit of background about where I started meeting some of these children that I talk about in starting in Blog 4. Blog 4 is pretty long and detailed. I am going to extend Blog 4, the discussion on this podcast, to next week as well. So let's start out with a full understanding of what a community mental health center is, because some people don't know, and some people have asked me, what do you mean by a community mental health center? So I like to give visuals. So let me give you a visual of what that means. In a neighborhood, of course, a lot of you know that you will find schools. One of the other things that you can find are universities and also local community mental health centers. A community mental health center does a variety of things. Okay, it's just not therapy, and it's just not psychological or educational testing. You can find them in various locations throughout the country. The individuals that work with in community mental health centers work very hard. It's not an easy job, not in the least bit, especially if you are a therapist there. So I have a lot of empathy for those of you who have worked at community mental health centers, because I have too. And so I know what it's like to do that job, and it's not easy. Okay. So one of the things is that they provide a variety of services. So there's crisis support at community mental health centers. There are school programs, after school programs. Some parents need, after school care, and some of the community mental health centers provide that type of support. Medication management. There are a lot of people who see psychiatrists at a community mental health center. And I want to share with you that there is a difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist. I want you to know that I am a psychologist, which is very different because I didn't go to medical school and I don't want to go to medical school. Although when I was younger, I thought I wanted to be a brain surgeon, and I saw some gory stuff in the hospital once and decided, yep, I'm done with that life of thinking about medical school. So I did not do that. However, a psychiatrist is a medical doctor. They just specialize in mental health. So those are the individuals that write prescriptions in most of your states for psychotropic medication. In my state, which is Illinois, there are some psychologists who can write prescriptions because they go to school and they learn to do that, which is something that I just learned that some psychologists can do in Illinois. Community mental health centers also provide various case management. So they deal with the homeless, they deal with homeless children, and sometimes they have to set them up into shelters so that they can have somewhere to live. Domestic violence shelters, community mental health centers have a wealth of resources and information. So let's just say they don't provide a safe haven for women who are abused physically or emotionally, or the children. More than likely, your community mental health center will have resources where you can find a safe place to go to get away from that type of domestic violence or abuse. There are early intervention programs. They believe in early childhood. So a lot of them have early childhood intervention programs. And I used to work for a company that had a very good early childhood program, a couple of them with community mental health centers. So if you can't get in with your school district, try your community mental health center and see if they have an early childhood program. And then there are various advocacy groups at community mental health centers that will deal with recovery from mental illness, recovery from drugs and alcohol, and even some medical ailments. I'll tell you, one of the community mental health centers that I worked with once was with Meharry Medical College. Meharry Medical College is located in Nashville, Tennessee, and it is a HBCU. Okay, that's a historically Black college and university, but it is a medical school. How about that? And it is closely tied with Fisk University, also in Nashville, Tennessee. So there I worked as a therapist for individuals who were diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. Love that job because it exposed me to a lot of different things that I had never been exposed to with community mental health, such as needle exchange programs and doing groups for those afflicted with HIV and AIDS. So it was a wonderful program. So that should give you a type of background about community mental health centers. So when I was very young and I started in psychology, I worked at quite a few community mental health centers. And so that is where I met a lot of the children that I'm going to talk about, in particular, the children that I met who could see what they called dark angels. Okay. So if you have questions about community mental health centers, let me know, because they have a lot of resources. Or if you have friends or you know of other therapists and psychologists and social workers who work for community mental health centers, ask them, for different resources that they have. Let me just say this too before I forget. Some of the things that community mental health centers treat in reference to mental health: anxiety, depression, psychotic disorders. They also treat eating disorders, PTSD. Our veterans sometimes go to community mental health centers for PTSD, and then personality disorders. Now, I work with children, so I don't see too many personality disorders. I don't see too many psychotic disorders either. So those areas are out of the areas of my expertise. So those are issues that I cannot give resources for. However, ADHD, which I love, I can give resources for those children that need assistance for ADHD or conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder, those type of conditions that afflict children. So now when you think about me working at a community mental health center, Now you have an idea of why these children were chosen to work with me. And sometimes I had control over who would come off the waiting list and see me from various mental health centers, and sometimes I didn't. In this case, at this community mental health center that we're going to talk about, these were children that were chosen for me. So what that means is that there is a waiting list, which, I'm sorry, guys, there is a long waiting list for psychological testing, educational testing, and also psychotherapy in mental health centers. We have an underabundance of, therapists and psychologists. And so that's the reason why there's such a long waiting list. So when you do get a child off the waiting list, you don't want to be too picky about who you are going to get off that waiting list. And typically they don't allow you to do that. You just take the next kid on the waiting list. And that's what I did. So when I encountered a lot of these kids, you have to take them. At least if you have a heart, you take them. And I had a heart. So I just took whatever child was on the list. So that goes to show you, just in that statement, that I sometimes had no idea what kind of kids I'm going to get. Now, when I say kind of, what it means is I probably know the referral question. So I would know why these children were actually coming to our community mental health center, but I didn't know anything about their abilities or their gifts or their grades until I did a clinical interview. And sometimes these things were revealed, at the beginning of, the clinical interview. Sometimes they weren't. In this case, when we're talking about Blog 4, I had no idea about any of this stuff. This was very new to me. This was in the early 2000s. I was still in my early 30s back then, and I was a training student psychologist. So all of this was new to me. So it is a process that I grew very fond of when working with these kids. So when you hear this story, I'm going to give you a disclaimer. It can be a little scary for some. It can be a little creepy. It can give you chills. It can do all of those things to you. And I want you to understand, I had them too. Okay. So in getting to Blog 4, I hope you are ready. Here's the visual. I told you I always talk about visuals. So here's the visual. Here's little old Lisa. Okay. I took someone off the waiting list, a family. And I remember a couple things I was told about the family, read about them, and realized this was a family that I had to do a home visit with because I believe the mother was disabled. So this was in Chicago too. So I had to go to their home. And that is difficult within itself, especially if you go alone. You never know who's hiding. You never know what you're going to get. You have to know these families pretty well, at least I do, before I go to the home. But the thing about this situation is that it was unique. I didn't know anything about this home. I had never been there. I was just told you have to do a home visit. Okay. And that's the same experience that some people get who work in social work when they have to go to a home. Especially your DCFS workers or your state workers, in child custody cases. So it required me to do home visits. And my very first clients they were a family comprised of two children. And for those of you who have questions about race, I will disclose this one. This was an interracial family. Okay. So I get questions about race all the time. Are the race of the children important? No, it's not important to me, but because it's important to you all, I will tell you this was an interracial family. So that goes to show you that race doesn't matter when it comes to seeing, spirits and ghosts. They don't discriminate. Just people discriminate. Okay. So I decided to go ahead and do this. I was extremely nervous. Again, I was a young psychologist, and I went over to the house, and I want you to get a real visual for this. Okay. These children had behavioral concerns, which I love. That's what I've been trained to do. And so my job was to go in and conduct behavioral interventions for these children. So I get to the house, I pull up and I get to the house, and the first thing I notice is that all the blinds were down, all the windows were closed, and I'm like, oh crap, you know, I'm not sure if I'm very comfortable, but this is my job and I have to do it. So it was a really light color house. Picture that. Chicago, on a certain side of Chicago, there are two flats. And so this was more of like a two flat, if you're familiar with those look like, or it looked like a two flat bungalow. So someone, not a two flat, but maybe more like a bungalow. Somebody lived upstairs, they lived downstairs. So I go knock on the door, and the person that answered the door was very nice to me, very gracious, made me feel completely safe. I go into the door and I stop because I noticed that everything is dark in the house. There are no lights on, the blinds are closed. And I remember looking around thinking, okay, why is everything closed? Why is it dark in here? The house felt heavy to me. Well, what does that feel like? Well, there was no air on. It was dark. It didn't smell. I've smelled this smell before. It's not a stench. It's more of it is humid in here, yet there's no airflow. That's why it felt heavy. Okay. And I started talking with the parent one, and things were okay. Very nice. This was the mother, extremely nice to me. And so I met the rest of the family, which included the two children, and they weren't misbehaving or anything. You know, they were just as gracious, thanked me for coming, et cetera, et cetera. And so I was told, let me just share the family dynamic. The mother did most of the talking. The father was pretty quiet. The mother talked to me about some of the behavioral challenges that the kids were having and what we were going to do to decrease that. But what I noticed was a pattern of the family being verbally aggressive toward each other. And that included the children. But what the children would do is that when that would happen, they would retreat to their bedrooms. So this is why when you read about Blog 4, you understand why there are so many things happening in the bedrooms. And it's because they will often retreat to their bedrooms. And so the parents gave me the authority to actually go around the house. So I was in the bedrooms, I was in the kitchen, I was in the living room, I was in the dining room, and they felt comfortable with that. And so when we had a positive rapport established, I would go and actually knock and get these kids out the bedroom. So the trim in the house was very dark. Okay. So the hallways were dark. And I felt more comfortable after a couple of sessions, knocking on the doors, telling the kid. I mean, you typically don't want to go in a kid's bedroom, right? Right? I mean, my own kids, I knock on the door when they're in their bedrooms. I just don't bust in because they're getting open. They're getting older, I'm sorry. So I knocked on the door, and it was pretty clear to me rather quickly that they were very fearful of their mother. And she would get to yelling and screaming and screeching. And these kids were very terrified of their mother. And she was just a tiny little woman. So I said, shoot, she's causing all kind of hell in this house, because she was just so tiny though. And I'm short and she's shorter than me. So when I was able to get the kids back into the living room to have therapy, group therapy or family therapy, I noticed something happening with these kids, and they would protect one another. So what they would do in conversation is child 2 would hover up under child 1, who was the older sibling. And if child 1 was sitting in a chair, child 2 would get up underneath the chair and sit up under child 1. And I'm a behaviorist by trade, remember I told you. So I would sit there and try to figure out why does child 2 feel the need to, you had to see it. It was almost as if child 2 was sitting up underneath child 1, protecting child 1. However, child 1 would hover over child 2. Does that make sense? Child 2 would hover over child 1, but child 1 would go up underneath child 2. So the conclusion that I came up with is that they are protecting one another. Both kids formed an attachment to me, and it was a pretty strong attachment, which is where you want when you're doing therapy with children, but you want it to be an appropriate attachment, and that's what these children had toward me. And when you have an appropriate attachment, children will typically tell you a whole lot of things. So if you are a parent and you put your kids in therapy, I want you to know they are telling us stuff, okay? I know a lot of secrets about parents that I can never tell. And these kids were that way. So we have formed a bond. I went to go see them at least in the beginning twice a week, every week. And I noticed that the mother started talking to me a lot about herself. Now, I want you to remember I was a training psychologist. So there are times when I didn't understand how to have a boundary with the mother because I thought my job was to listen to all of them. And that was not the case. So as they formed an attachment to me, the kids rather, they started sharing a lot of their inner thoughts, okay? And they started sharing a lot of feelings about their family life. And one day I was sitting in a chair in child 1's bedroom. And child 1 said something that shook me to the core and that I will never forget. And child 1 said to me, "I keep a machete under my bed." I had to pause for a minute because my mind went back to that moment. And I remember seeing the machete because child 1 showed it to me. What the heck are you doing with the machete? Right? Okay, no, I didn't say that, but that's how I felt. And what the heck you gonna do with it? So appropriately, I asked this child, what, sweetheart, first of all, give it to me. Second of all, what the hell are we gonna do with a machete? And child 1 said to me, "I use it to protect myself." Really? Protect yourself from what? I had to take a sip of glass of wine because I'm having flashbacks. What are you going to do with that machete? I'm protecting myself. From who? My mother. What do you mean protecting yourself from your mother? And at that moment, I started to wonder if the mother had made threats to hurt this kid. So now we have a whole nother component here. Now let me stop this. Understand, this is where mental health and the ability to see spirits come into play, okay? You can see spirits all day long, but if you are taking it to a place where a psychologist has to jump in and figure out, based upon what you said, how we're going to hospitalize you because you just said you're going to hurt your mother, then that's obviously mental health, okay? Now, that's all I knew at this point. I didn't know anything about these kids being able to see spirits or ghosts or angels or demons. Nothing. All right. So He specifically said, I'm going to use this machete to stab my mother if she attacks me at night. So, what do you all think I had to do? Yep, I had to call the state to report it. I had to contact who I needed to in order to get this child hospitalized. This is the first child. Get permission from the family in order to have this child hospitalized. And what else do you do when there's a threat to harm someone else? Yep, you have to tell the person. So I had to tell this mother, duty to warn. That's right. And that is not just state law, that is federal law. Good job. And so I had a duty to warn. Okay. Now we took care of it. I hate to do this to kids, but you have to notify the police. I mean, we took care of it because no matter what this mom allegedly did to these kids, at that moment, I had to protect her because he gave me a machete. Hello. And told me he was going to stab her. He said if she attacked me, but what I found out is that she had been making threats toward him. So that was a whole nother ball game, and it's irrelevant. So we're going to stay focused on these kids right now. So this one was hospitalized, okay, for quite a while. And we made sure that everyone was safe from harm. And what I didn't write in the blog, I don't think, is that the police actually did intervene with the mom as well and told her, whatever police do in that situation, she had to stop, threatening those kids as well. And she was very, you ever heard somebody yell and they sound like a chihuahua? That's how she sounded when she would fuss at these kids and yell at them. Oh my God, I can still hear her voice, and it is like 20 something years beyond that. So at the time of, this hospitalization and we intervened with the police, I still didn't know that these kids had this ability, okay? After a full investigation with the state, I continued to work with these kids. I never let them go. And what's interesting is that I would just go over there and talk to child 2 at this point. And child 2 gave me an earful. I mean, an earful about what was happening. So I learned about the mother's behavior. Mom was, according to child 2, very paranoid, thinking that things were in the house, thinking that something was in the basement, thinking that something was bothering her children, and child 2 shared with me that child 2 also had a weapon to protect oneself from the mother. Yes, I had to do this all over again. However, child 2 was not hospitalized. Child 2 was only threatened by the mother. Child 1 influenced child 2 to have a weapon, okay? And when child 2 and I talked, child 2 said, my mother only behaves like this, Dr. Lisa, or almost Dr. Lisa. I'm so used to calling myself Dr. Lisa, sorry. When mom sees ghosts. Rewind. What? My mom only acts like this when she sees ghosts. I had to sit down on the bed because then I started thinking that child 2 was psychotic, okay? Seeing ghosts. What do you mean by seeing ghosts? Well, I know when my mom is starting to see ghosts. I also know when child one is seeing ghosts because they both act the same when the ghosts come out. And so I'm just listening at this point because I'm completely shocked. I don't know what to say or do. Okay. And this kid talked about, the ghost that comes out is really dark and influences child one and also influences my mother. And so they get to talking. And when this dark ghost comes out, it has wings and it tells my mother to uh, harm us or yell at us. What do you mean? For God's sake, what is something dark with wings that comes out? This child said, okay, my mother is seeing ghosts. My mother is seeing things. My mother is yelling at us, and my older sibling can do it as well. Well, okay. So I was new in the field. It was a lot for me to handle. I thought that this family, all of them, um, were psychotic. The father was very quiet, watched all this happen, didn't intervene much, didn't say anything. When child one was hospitalized, the father went outside, wouldn't deal with it. He was very aloof. And this mother yelled at him a lot. I told you she was like the chihuahua yelling. And so if I look back you know, at my age now, he was probably sick of her and just said, you know what? She does this all the time. I'm going outside. Screw it. Right. However, he refused to deal with it. And so I'm left typically dealing with the mother and, being new in the field and you've hospitalized someone. Then you have a sibling talking about ghosts in the house and that both of them behave negatively toward one another and want to harm one another when they both see ghosts. When the ghost appears, I said, these people are psychotic. And by the way, what do you see? So I think earlier I mentioned both children saw ghosts or spirits. The child two, I don't think necessarily saw them, but the child two and the older child were so close that maybe some of this was influenced on to child two, if that makes sense. Child two knew everything. And child two explained to me, it's not that child one is quote unquote not from me, but I will say the word crazy. Okay. Child two said, it's not that my sibling is crazy. It's not even that my mother is crazy. They only do this when this ghost appears in the house. Okay. And so I said, I remember we were sitting down because we were in the kitchen. And the kitchen was, you remember that 1970, some of you may be old enough, that 1970s the golden yellow stove. Those are the appliances. And I remember child two saying, I don't come in the kitchen because child one told her that this dark being was in the kitchen and also in the basement. And so that is why child two, when this thing appeared, would go into retreat because the older sibling would say, hey, there's this dark spirit or ghost in the kitchen. Child one would talk to this ghost. Okay. And child two would tell me, remember, child two is a younger sibling, that child one would get easily influenced by the being that was in their home. Okay. And so when we were in the kitchen, I decided to really kind of assess the house. Um, it was interesting to me because at that point, I remember thinking it's too much for me to handle as a young therapist. I don't know what to do. So when I got back I had a really savvy friend back then at my job, who is now a licensed psychologist in Chicago. And I remember we were there together, and, I would collaborate about these things. So remember, I mentioned I've been talking about this stuff for years. So this dates back again to the early 2000s. And I wanted to consult with that psychologist, but also, other people who were therapists there, because as you can imagine, being that young in the field, that was a lot, including psychotic disorders, which I had no experience with back then, especially with how to treat them. And so being a young psychologist, my thought was, all of this, they're hallucinating, they have delusions, they have all the classic symptoms of schizophrenia. I'm looking in books. I guess it was the DSM-3 maybe back then. And so I'm looking through that, or maybe it was the 4, I don't remember. I'm like, okay, checking off stuff that would allude to, any type of psychotic disorder, that involve hallucinations. And you know what? I couldn't find anything that fit at the time. And I remember sitting there thinking, there is nothing that fits into the categories that I'm looking at in these books. And you know why? It was because it was so different. And what does different mean? You have this coherent child 2, who is so coherent that she's telling me everything, yet she's telling me that, her mother, who is also very coherent, can do these things, and yet I don't see them. I don't know what they're talking about. And on the other hand, you had all these odd behaviors as well. So the talking to corners from the mom, or talking up to the sky, or telling me finally, yeah, we see ghosts. You should see me scratching my head. Because that's how I felt, And, it gets tricky to divide mental illness in between, the ability to see ghosts and is this truly mental illness? Okay. Back then it was tricky, but there was one person a long time ago who said something very wise to me in that moment. Assess them where they are now. Obviously, this kid had to be hospitalized. We had to get this kid treatment because this kid cannot kill the mother. Okay? That's what you saw at the time. Everything that's outlined, we will deal with that. Who are we to judge whether or not these individuals see ghosts? That stuck with me because I actually heard that again a couple of years ago, less than 5. Okay, so child 1 gets out of the hospital, okay? I did not stop seeing these kids. I had to go back to the house. And it was still dark and closed off house. There was still no windows open, okay? So, I had to go check on child 1. Child 1, the behaviors were still odd. And the reason I say odd is because child 1 stayed in child 1's room, away from the mother, pretty antisocial toward the family, which this was not an antisocial kid, right? This kid was very talkative. So there was nothing antisocial about this kid until the kid started to feel a certain way about the mother. So I decided to knock on the kid's bedroom door, and this kid actually adored me and vice versa. So I opened the door. The sibling, child 2, and I walk in the door, and we have a conversation about, some of the things that child 2 said to me. Child 1 goes, yes, I do. I see ghosts. And, I actually saw a ghost last night. And, when you came in, it left because it was just here. And I'm like, wait, there was just a ghost in your room? Yeah. Well, what did it look like? Well, it was dark. I mean, dark blue, dark black, dark gray. I mean, what does dark mean? It was black. Well, what else did it look like? Well, it has wings. What do you mean it has wings? Describe it. Um, like angel wings. Angel wings? Like a dark angel. Like it looks like God's angels, but dark. Oh, well, what does it tell you to do? Well, it tells me to protect myself from my mother. And if I can't do that, to harm my mother. Here we go again. Honey, you can't harm your mother. No, I don't want to harm my mother, but this is what it tells me to do. So immediately I go and talk to the mother about this. And, she's like, well, what are we going to do? Blah, blah, blah. So we come up with a plan. I come up with the plan with the state worker to address this. And the state worker didn't feel at that point as if this kid needs to be hospitalized again, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, okay, well, let's just put, some interventions in place in order to make sure that everyone is safe. Guys, let me tell you, I walked back into, because what I wanted to do was to go and tell, I had talked to the mom about putting some interventions in place. I always like to tell kids, especially older ones, and these were older children, what the plan is, what we can do. And I'm still the therapist, right? So I go into the room, I knock on the door, go through the kitchen, take a right, go down the hallway. Again, the hallway is dark. And I knock on the door, and this kid says, come in. And I will never forget this in a million years. You know what this kid did? Oh my God. This kid took this kid's blood and drew a 666 on the wall with a 6-star symbol. And I looked at it and it shook me to the core, and I stopped in my tracks. And what this child did was, this child slit one wrist, the left wrist, because this child was laying in the bed and had taken the index finger and drawn 666 on the wall with a 6-star symbol. And I'm trying to think, was there anything else that was drawn on the wall? Also, I think put that on the left leg, because the leg was hanging off the bed too. And so I, just I called an ambulance at that point for this child's health, but also because I'm not a physician and didn't know how to stop the bleeding. I talked to this child a lot while we were waiting on the ambulance, and I sat on this child's bed, and this child was just talking to me about why that happened. This dark angel that this child saw guided this child in doing this. And despite removing all the machetes, there was something else in the room that this child used to cut that left wrist. And the reason was because this quote unquote dark angel, because that's what it was described as, shared that, I want you to do this. And this child did it. So needless to say, as we were talking, I asked how did it sound? It sounded like it was a man with a deep voice. It was teaching this child how to do it, and would hide in the closet when I would come into the room. The mother could see it as well. And at that point, while we're waiting on the ambulance, I also asked, why would you want to harm yourself? Why would you want to hurt your mother and yourself? And the explanation went right back to whatever this dark entity was in the room. And there was something that this kid, I don't quite remember how we got on this conversation, but this is the same child who told me that these dark spirits shift change. You know what that means? That they can conform to other shapes or other beings. Because this child was watching, I'm not going to say the network on my podcast, but there was a popular cartoon show back then. And hey, this is the reason why my kids don't watch that cartoon show, by the way, to this day. My kid, this child said to me, that sometimes when this child would watch this cartoon show, that this thing that will hide in the closet would change form into what this kid was watching on TV. Okay. And so I thought, wow, I just held this kid's hand. I mean, I didn't know what else to do but to hold this child's hand and then hold child's two hand, because at this point, child two is hysterical. I mean, I can't imagine seeing my siblings bleeding like that. So child two was pretty hysterical. So I just held child two's hand. So I'm in between both of them. Now, mind you, when it comes to blood, you don't, unless you're a physician and you know how to remain safe. Back then, I know what to do now, but back then, I didn't know as much. I knew what I learned from working at Meharry Medical College. And I knew without the proper gloves and stuff like that, you don't touch it. So I didn't touch it. So I sat, you have to picture it. So he's like on the left side of the bed. I'm kind of between holding the right hand. Child two is on my right. So I'm in between trying to do the best that I could to process all of this, but also to, calm them down. So child one, the one that cut the left wrist, said to me, this thing in the closet does not like you. Every time you come into the room, it leaves. It goes into the closet and it's mad. It doesn't like you. It doesn't think that you can help me, blah, 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 blah. And this child said something to me that I heard several times from children. The reason that the dark angel didn't like me, this child said, you glow to this dark angel. Glow? What does that mean? You glow white. You can't see it, but we can see it. And my mother said it when you walked into the door, that you glow white. I don't exactly know to this day what that means, but I've heard it several times. And that is the basis for why when kids that I've worked with do see dark angels, they do not want me around the kids. Collectively, in different cities and different kids have told me that about myself. So I don't mind sharing with you guys some of the things that these wonderful children have told me about myself, because I think it helps you to understand from their perspective what they saw. So that's something that I heard. And obviously I can't see the glow, not at all, but these children can, see it. So over time, I believe what these kids have said to me about, glowing white. So, just to sum it up, this child one was taken to the hospital. We had to. I mean, I didn't know back then if it was a suicide attempt as a result of, what this dark angel had told this kid. All I know is that this kid cut the left wrist and drew blood on the wall, 666, 6-star, and shared that this dark angel told this kid to do it, and also earlier to protect because the mother will harm him. So I'm going to have to, I can't wait to tell you how this ended because it was fascinating. So what did I do after this? I am someone, when I encounter something different, I will go study it. I studied it. Oh my God. I studied what this stuff means. I had 2 babies under my care and a mother who claimed that they could see ghosts and they can see dark angels. The first baby was hospitalized twice under my care, claiming that, not only did this child want to harm the mother, but later on slit the left wrist as a result of hearing something telling this child to harm the self. And so back then, it was just strange to me. And let me just share with you before we wrap it up how the mother behaved. I could tell that the mother was seeing something. The challenge with me back then was being so inexperienced. I didn't know if the mother was actually, seeing something or if the mother was psychotic. Back then, remember, this is years ago. And so what the mom would do sometimes, you guys can't see me, but I'm pointing like around the room where I am. Sometimes the mother would just start talking to something in the room or fussing at it, or she would just kind of glance around the room and she was just mad, like, go away. And I would sit there like, okay, what is happening with this mom? And then when we finally started talking about these dark angels that were in the house, or this dark angel, then the mom started sharing with me, yes, there's a dark angel and you need to do something about the dark angel. And there's a dark angel in our house. And I'm like, what is a dark angel? And she said to me, it's a demon. Wait, you have demons in your house? Yes, and it won't go away. Well, I don't know what to do. I mean, is it truly a demon? Yes, it's a demon. I can see it. It's a demon. It's what has my son so upset and harming himself, And over time, I saw a couple of behaviors in the mom that were not okay. And so we are going to touch upon those next week. And that is when we are definitely going to dive into the difference between mental illness and the ability to see ghosts. And the reason that I got into it and was able to learn about the difference and believe these kids had this ability, that actually took many years. Now I'm starting to talk about it. But this was the first family that I met that had this ability, and I started to study it and I started to get into it because I had to figure out how to help these wonderful individuals. No matter what they did to themselves, to me, they were wonderful. And I was assigned the task to help them, and I had to figure it out. And I did. So what we're going to do next week is we're going to go back to blog 4, and I'm going to share with you how it ended. And we're going to talk about mental illness and distinguish that from the ability to see ghosts and spirits. So if you have any questions, do not forget to ask them. I'm so open. I try to answer all questions. I'm going to dedicate one podcast to answering questions because I'm getting a lot of them, which is great. So keep giving them to me. You guys can call me 765-205-1959, or you can send me an email at kidscanseeghosts@gmail.com. I am all over the place. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. You can hear me on iTunes. You can hear me on Spotify. You can hear me on iHeartRadio. I am everywhere, and I appreciate you all listening. If you want to be on the show, all you have to do is tell me. I'm on Quora. Oh my God. Quora has some wonderful people that have been contacting me on their website. So I appreciate you guys. I want you to have a good night. And I will see you at 5 o'clock p.m. next week. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.